Stanley Kubrick was not a prolific filmmaker. Over the course of his 46-year-long career, his output comprised just 13 theatrical films. Compare that to Steven Spielberg, Kubrick's close friend and posthumous colleague, who has managed to direct 31 films in a similar length of time. So it is quite striking to note, over such a sparse canon spread over so many years, just how often a single theme recurs in Kubrick's work. Mankind places its trust in technology, only for that technology to turn on it. In Dr. Strangelove, the world is set afire by a godlike machine meant to keep it safe. In 2001, the crew of Discovery are exterminated by their supposedly benevolent onboard computer. In A Clockwork Orange, a combination of brutal technology and psychological torture is meant to protect society from criminals, but ultimately exposes its hypocrisies. And in AI, which Spielberg completed after Kubrick's death, mankind is the author of its own destruction, and only its machine children are left to carry on its legacy. Journalist Robert Kolker noted that Kubrick's life's work comprises, quote, one long film about the ways in which people attempt to impose themselves on their worlds, erecting enormous barriers, schemes, structures, and technologies to which they yield their power, lose their agency in the world, and via which are ultimately destroyed. And this is somewhat odd, because Kubrick's reputation is that of a supreme technician, a man who, according to legend, saw human beings merely as fleshy props to be positioned in his minutely planned compositions. He was known for demanding up to 100 takes for a single shot. In one memorable moment from the filming of The Shining, after 75 takes of shutting a car door, elderly actor Scatman Crothers broke down and asked, "What do you want, Mr. Kubrick? What do you want?" Kubrick's film sets were essentially miniature worlds over which he had complete control. He famously rebuilt New York and London for Eyes Wide Shut, rather than simply film there, and in the process gave that 3-room chamber piece a budget comparable to Jurassic Park. His demands for absolute realism gave 2001 a 2-year post-production schedule and pushed special effects to new levels that hold up even now. The centrifugal effects were created using a 30-ton, 10-meter rotating wheel built by aircraft manufacturer Vickers Armstrong, which alone consumed a 16th of the film's budget. Douglas Trumbull, the 23-year-old FX wonderkind who would go on to work on Close Encounters and Blade Runner, adapted the slit-scan photography technique for the climactic Stargate sequence. The backlit images, comprising electron micrographs, op art from magazines, and gels, were moved by a slit in front of the camera, which was slowly moved toward the slit to create the tunnel effect seen in the film. Most effects shots, however, simply applied brute force. The moment when Bowman blows himself into the airlock was a 2-story vertical bungee jump toward the camera. The famous shot of the stewardess plucking the pen out of the air was accomplished with a sheet of rotating glass and a piece of double-sided tape. If you look closely, you can see the slight tug when she pulls the pen off the glass. The makeup for the ape men at the start was so realistic, aided by superb acting by a cast of mimes who spent months studying primate behavior, that people even today ask if they were actual apes. Even so, 2001 lost the 1968 honorary Oscar for makeup to, ironically, Planet of the Apes. 2001 is, in its very nature, a hymn to the power of technology to uplift, inform, and inspire humanity. So why does its story turn on the death of a homicidal machine? 2001 reuses Strangelove's visual metaphors of technology as sex, which the former employed to humorous effect by playing up the characters, all of whom had grotesquely sexualized names like Turgidson, Muffley, and of course Strangelove, as immature, sexually driven schoolchildren playing with their globally destructive toys. Here the illusion is less judgmental. Humanity is presented as having regressed to an infantile state, though less by choice than by the power of our technology. To exist in space, we must relearn how to walk, eat, and even go to the toilet. Our every move is monitored by all-powerful parent figures who cater to our every whim. Birth and birthdays are mentioned frequently. The only calls from home and from family are on birthdays. Hal mentions his birthday as he dies, and of course, the Star Child is presented as unborn. 2001 offers us a world in which machines have replaced gods. Quote, "Man has always worshipped beauty," said Kubrick, and I think there's a new kind of beauty afoot in the world. But it is not necessarily a pleasant or fulfilling beauty. Kubrick employs many of the aesthetics of science fiction, bright lights, shining surfaces, and yet through his eyes they seem less beautiful than soulless and dehumanizing. Much has been made of the acting in this film, which has also been described as soulless and inhuman. This was very deliberate, as can be seen from the casting of the actors themselves. Keir Dullea and Gary Lockwood, the actors portraying Bowman and Poole respectively, were cast as much for their physiques as for their acting ability. William Sylvester, who played Heywood Floyd, was cast largely because he was bland and wore a suit well. Dullea was cast after Kubrick had seen him in a film called Bunny Lake is Missing, in which he played a man whose calm, rational exterior hid a well of deep psychosis and delusion. In other words, someone who could keep his emotions in check. For the casting of one particular character, however, Kubrick went in the absolute opposite direction. Kubrick and Clarke had watched many astronomical documentaries to explore the possibilities of special effects. One, a short piece from Canada simply called Universe, was narrated by a Shakespearean actor named Douglas Rain.
It will take immense courage to journey to this place, for on this pitted and pocked ball of pumice and stone there is no atmosphere, no air to breathe, no sound to hear.
In its natural state, his voice has little to distinguish it, but slow it down, lower the register, and smooth the consonants a bit, and you have one of the most iconic, influential, and parodied voices in the history of cinema.
The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.
Lockwood and Dullea were on set for a year. Rain worked for a total of 9 hours, and has reportedly never even watched 2001. Nonetheless, it has been noted time and time again that his character, Hal 9000, is by far the most human in the film. While the human occupants of Discovery 1 display all the emotionality of plastic figurines, Hal's emotionality is so obvious it is even commented on in the film.
I asked him about his abilities. I sensed a certain pride in his answer about his accuracy and perfection.
But later uncertainty and even self-doubt.
But during the past few weeks, I've wondered whether you might be having some second thoughts about the mission. It's rather difficult to define. Perhaps I'm just projecting my own concern about it.
It is then, in a sudden jerking,
Just a moment,
that Hal tells his first lie, seemingly signaling his breakdown and marking the start of his plot to kill the crew. When initially confronted, Hal is cruel and dismissive.
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
But as Bowman marches ever closer to his brain, his pleading becomes ever more desperate and childlike.
Dave, stop. Stop, will you? Stop, Dave.
In the most emotionally engaging scene in the film, as his mind is being systematically annihilated, Hal reverts to a state of innocence, and, at the tearful request of the suddenly overcome Bowman, begins to warble the music hall standard Daisy Bell, which gradually unwinds as his mind collapses.
I'm half crazy, all for the love of you. It won't be a stylish marriage. I can't afford a carriage. But you look sweet. The sheep.
Hal is the ultimate expression of the technological ambivalence at the heart of 2001. He can be seen as yet another birth, mankind's attempt at procreation. In fact, the entire midsection of the film could be seen as humanity's unintended refusal of the aliens' call toward physical and mental transcendence and an attempt to forge their own path to transcendence through machinery. This theme was the focus of the most obvious creative tension between Clarke and Kubrick. In the novel, Clarke gives Hal an excuse for his behavior. As explained in his speech to the BBC, the 9000 series does not distort information, but Hal was ordered to keep the existence of the monolith a secret from the crew. The only way he could resolve the conflict between these two directives was to kill the crew and complete the mission himself, as the novel makes clear he was fully capable of doing. In Clarke's vision, the flaws are purely human, a simple case of garbage in, garbage out. Although this rationale for Hal's actions was likely initially Kubrick's idea, he slowly pared it away, along with all the other concrete explanations, leaving the Hal of the film as incomprehensible and unaccountable as the monolith. There is a telling discrepancy between the film and the novel that sheds light on how each of its creators saw Hal. Kubrick gives Hal's birth year as 1992. Clarke gives it as 1997. Giving Hal an age of 9 versus an age of 4 may not seem all that pertinent, but it is the difference between a sentient being that must be taught and instructed, and a programmed machine that can simply have all its knowledge dumped into it. The human characters in 2001 are bland and uninteresting because, ultimately, they don't matter. They exist merely as fleshy appendages to the terrifying, perfect body of the machine. The only meaningful relationships they have are either with technology or through technology. But Clarke and Kubrick interpret this in very different ways. In the novel, Clarke says that Bowman, quote, existed in symbiosis with the ship. This echoes a later paragraph in which Bowman speculates about the evolution of his alien hosts. Quote, they would get rid of the fragile, disease and accident-prone homes that nature had given them, and which doomed them to inevitable death. They would replace their natural bodies as they wore out, or perhaps even before that, by constructions of metal and plastic, and would thus achieve immortality. Eventually, even the brain might go. As the seat of consciousness, it was not essential. The development of electronic intelligence had proved that. The conflict between mind and machine might be resolved at last in the eternal truce of complete symbiosis. This vision of cyber synthesis, now called transhumanism, has become a major philosophy in recent years, and many transhumanists consider Arthur C. Clarke an early convert. In the film, transhumanism is portrayed as a blind alley, a way from which we must be redirected by our extraterrestrial betters. Technology does not progress the human, it infantilizes him and reduces him to the state of a consumer. Tellingly, Bowman's transformation in the Cosmic Hotel is also the first time since the start of the film that anyone eats unprocessed food. In that same paragraph cited above, Clarke goes on to say that transhumanism would climax in the transition of humanity to pure energy, what was once called spirit, epitomized in the Star Child. But Kubrick takes that reading away, hiding the technological and forcing us to confront the possibility of the mystical. In that sense, 2001 is very much in line with the romantic view of science, that there exists at the core of nature something unknowable, indivisible, and undeconstructible, something that no tool can reach or dissect. Science, in other words, is sublime. The myth of 2001, therefore, could be seen as a counter-myth to the equally potent one then being spun by Gene Roddenberry on American television. Star Trek is the myth of the technocrat triumphant. The machine is an extension of human will and energy, and at the word of a captain or the push of a button, drives humanity on to further knowledge and power. 2001 suggests that our ability to harness that power is limited by our narrow comprehension and innate human failings, and that some things may remain forever hidden behind a black box, until revealed by a benevolent higher intelligence. 2001 also acts as a counter to the myths of previous ages, which were fixed on the past. The Odyssey ends with everything as close as possible to what had always been. 2001, conversely, points uneasily toward the future, suggesting that, for better or worse, things will never be the same again. You may have noticed that I have made very few mentions of science in this series so far, and there's a good reason for that. Kubrick's obsessive, fastidious nature extended to scientific and technical accuracy. Not only is 2001 scientifically accurate, it's more scientifically accurate than the vast majority of space operas made before or even since. Case in point, one of the most frequently used tropes in all of space fiction, sound, is completely absent in 2001's depiction of space. All you hear is the slow, deliberate breathing of the characters as they move about their languid business. And yes, it is as unsettling as you'd imagine. In most science fiction spaceships, gravity is taken for granted, usually hand-waved away by some exotic form of physics. But 2001 positively revels in the use of centripetal force as the only realistic gravity substitute. Both of these accuracies serve to demonstrate just how utterly alien space is, and how far beyond our everyday understanding. David Bowman's famous airlock ingress has been lauded for its accurate depiction of exposure to space. While nearly everyone these days knows that you don't explode if exposed to a vacuum, Clarke always disliked the fact that Bowman holds his breath in that scene, instead of exhaling, which would be the proper thing to do. In keeping with a trip to Jupiter, Discovery passes through the Asteroid Belt, though, unlike those seen in subsequent sci-fi, in 2001 the Asteroid Belt is portrayed as it really is, nearly empty. In fact, the two random rocks seen flying away from the ship are sopped too far. To get that close, the Discovery would have to have been aiming for them, which, in the novel, it is. The film's depiction of the Jupiter system is eerily prescient of the images that the Voyagers would return a decade later. The original script, as well as the novel, has the climax occur around Saturn, but no one could figure out a way to make the rings realistic, which is a good thing because the Voyagers reveal that Saturn's rings were far more complex and wild than anyone had ever imagined, and there is no way they could ever have done them justice, even if they had the means. Perhaps 2001's most interesting nod to science is in its depiction of higher dimensions. In the hotel room scene at the end, we see David Bowman appearing to step through different stages of his life, first observing and then becoming his future self. This makes sense if you envision time as Einstein did, a dimension identical to, and inseparable from, space. We contend ourselves that we are masters of all we survey within our three-dimensional domain, but we are blind and crippled in the fourth, tied to a careening railcar as it speeds us inexorably toward death. But what if we became masters of that domain too? What would we see? A human life would not be a person, but a chain of infinitesimal moments undulating across a higher dimensional landscape, from birth to death. We could travel along its length and see a man slowly shrink to a child, or wizen to old age. Perhaps Bowman's time in the hotel was akin to wandering a higher dimensional hallway, each turn offering a glimpse around the corner. We've become so accustomed to the narrative of human evolution that we've forgotten just how recent many of its discoveries were. 2001's depiction of Australopithecines as human ancestors would have been audaciously controversial just 20 years earlier. It was only in 1947 that Australopithecus was classified as a hominid, even though it had been known since 1924. Lucy, the early Australopithecus that confirmed that upright posture, not increased brain size, was our first step to humanity, would not be found until 1974, and the Piltdown Man, the monkey-faced missing link with the human brain that had been so gratifyingly found in Europe instead of Africa, had only been proven to be a hoax in 1953. Given that, 2001's depiction of our ancestors as barely sapient, ape-like upright walkers is almost prophetic. The idea that the human brain grew in size through the extra calories provided by eating meat is now widely accepted as fact. Though 2001's date may be anachronistic, many of its technological predictions have ultimately come true. Clarke found the chilling scene in which Hal outfoxes his opponents by reading their lips preposterous, believing that to be beyond the abilities of a computer. Now, computers regularly beat humans at it. When Hal was first conceived, computer voices were mere playthings. Clarke famously chose Daisy Bell as Hal's personal death lament because it was the first song ever sung by a computer, only 3 years before 2001 entered production. Today, computer assistants speak to us all the time, often in voices strangely reminiscent of HAL. Pan Am may be defunct, but the first commercial space airplane may launch as early as this year. The film's whirling space station may seem like the stuff of dreams, but organizations like the Gateway Foundation have similar projects on the drawing board. Look closely and you will see the ancestors of tablets, Skype, digital television, graphical cockpit displays, Prozac.
I honestly think you ought to sit down calmly, take a stress pill, and think things over.
And seat-back in-flight entertainment. On the recommendation of Clarke, Kubrick hired Fred Ordway, a geoscientist who, like Clarke, published many articles on the future of spaceflight, and Harry Lang, an illustrator who composed images for Wernher von Braun's future projects at NASA, to ensure that the film's depiction of spacecraft and space travel would be as true to reality as possible. Ordway and Lang insisted on knowing, quote, the purpose and functioning of each assembly and component, down to the labeling of individual buttons and the presentation on screens of plausible operating, diagnostic, and other data, unquote. Tech companies of the day, such as Honeywell, Boeing, General Dynamics, Bell Telephone, and of course, IBM, provided hardware and documentation free of charge in exchange for product placement. Contrary to popular belief, HAL was never intended as IBM with the letters moved one backward, though Clarke has noted that IBM appear to have done well out of that association. NASA Apollo Administrator George Mueller and astronaut Deke Slayton dubbed 2001's production facility NASA East after seeing the production designs and model work. Of course, 2001 also got many things wrong. While the novel correctly predicted that Australopithecus used stone tools, a hypothesis not confirmed until 2010, the year, not the movie, Kubrick goes for the then controversial and now discredited osteodontochoratic hypothesis of tool use, or that the earliest hominids used bones and teeth of animals as tools, arguably for visual simplicity and, well, other reasons. The glorious images of the planets and moons in alignment could never occur as they do in the film. The moon, for instance, is always new when close to the sun, so they can never be seen so close together. Light does not diffuse in space the way it does in air, and the Discovery would be pitch black on its far side. Despite no one ever actually having landed on the moon by the time 2001 was being made, early concept art had depicted its surface remarkably accurately, with the soft, rounded edges we've come to expect from lunar photos. But Kubrick decided they weren't dramatic enough, and so jacked up the shadows and jagged peaks. Perhaps the most touching error was 2001's depiction of the Earth, as up until that time, no one had taken a color image of the Earth from space. The first such image, the now legendary Earthrise photograph by Apollo 8, was snapped the year of 2001's release. 2001 had been a hit with Apollo 8's crew, and the mission commander, whose name, oddly enough, was Frank Borman, joked that as he traveled around the dark side of the moon, he wished he could have found a monolith there. The most ironic predictions, from our point of view at least, are of course related to computers. 2001's future has video phones but no mobile phones, sentient computers that still use punch cards, tablets for outputs but pens for input. The root of this irony lies in a single misconception that will pervade much of 2001. As I said earlier, Arthur C. Clarke was the first to imagine that geostationary satellites could be used for telecommunication, but after having worked for the post office studying wire and valve communications, he imagined that the satellites would have to be bulking, awkward, vacuum-tubed things that could easily break, and so saw each satellite as a manned outpost, with the mechanic at the ready to fix any emergent issues. Indeed, the very existence of Discovery 1 could be seen as a variant of this prediction. After all, there is little about the Jupiter system that a well-designed unmanned probe couldn't learn, as the last 40 years of space exploration have shown. That isn't to say that the coming age of miniaturization caught Kubrick and Clarke completely off guard. Kubrick in particular was aware of the advances being made as NASA sought to count every stray kilogram. When IBM presented its first concept art for what would become HAL, Kubrick responded with the following: "The IBM Athena, i.e. HAL, Drawings are useless and totally irrelevant to our needs. I am extremely bored and depressed by all this abysmal waste of time. Annoyed, but lovingly, S. His beef with IBM appeared to be that they still envisioned HAL as a mainframe, while Kubrick saw him as fully integrated into the ship. The microchip was still a decade away, but Kubrick was already seeing the future. Of course, there remains the glaring red light hovering over all of this. No, even nearly 20 years after the actual 2001, we still do not have an artificial intelligence capable of thinking like a human. From a modern perspective, the sheer optimism displayed in the creation of HAL seems strange. How could anyone have imagined that we could recreate a human mind so perfectly within 30 years? And yet, their enthusiasm wasn't entirely unfounded. Early computer programmers were astounded by the idea that computers could play chess. Chess was something intelligent people played. Ergo, if computers could play chess, they could also be intelligent. But as the science of artificial intelligence gained firmer ground, it was realized that things humans found hard, like chess, are a cinch for a computer, while things humans found easy, like natural language, visual processing, and artistic appreciation, are hard. The current trend in AI has been to focus machine intelligence on specific tasks. A chess bot cannot play tic-tac-toe. A speech decoder trained on the phone cannot recognize speech on a microphone. Since this has produced exceptionally useful and profitable results, it has been the driving force of AI research for the last 30 years. The problem of creating a machine that could reason like a human, the initial problem AI intended to solve, has been largely abandoned. Clarke actually gets around this problem in the novel. Rather than a transposition of IBM, HAL in fact stands for Heuristically Programmed Algorithmic Computer. Heuristics are the process by which one programs a computer using trial and error. For instance, YouTube bots learn how to better select the best videos by being sent by the million to teacher bots who grade their abilities and then send the failures to the recycle bin, while the successes are kept, copied, and then randomly changed. Over the course of thousands of selections, this form of bot breeding eventually creates the bot that can do the job. Problem is, no one really knows how. It just can. Clarke saw this form of programming as an easy way to get around the black box of artificial intelligence, since we could have a computer capable of mimicking the human mind without having to go to the trouble of designing one. The problem is, as AI researchers have pointed out, heuristics may work for bots, for now, but it is a terrible way to program computers, precisely because you need to know what's broken if something goes wrong. In his book Homo Deus, Yuval Noah Harari speculates on just how complex these heuristically designed bots could become. He noted that mindless algorithms can already compose music indistinguishable from classical greats, simply by having their music programmed into them, or even compose haiku indistinguishable from human authors. He posed the question, is consciousness necessary for intelligence? Can you have a machine that performs all the necessary functions of conscious being without actually being conscious? Are intelligence and consciousness, as Harari put it, decoupling? HAL, who views himself as a conscious entity, develops homicidal paranoia after being ordered to lie. In essence, he fails because he becomes too human. Our true future may be governed by entities who succeed because they are less than human. And that, fellow seekers, is the end. An 8-week odyssey into my favorite film of all time. I do have some plans to continue this. I still have about 700 words of notes that didn't make it into the script. But for now I will leave the realm of media and return to more robust topics. So far the feedback on this series has been wonderful, but I think I know where my priorities should be for now. I hope you all gained something from the experience, as I did, and I hope to see you around Neptune.